Barber, looking at Henry VIII. Today we're going to be focusing on Cromwell and his government between 1530 to 1540. When Cromwell was arrested in 1540, all of his notes and papers were confiscated and preserved. These included draft letters and scribbled notes, as well as a series of documents where Cromwell recorded all the ideas he wished to discuss with the king. Using these, historians can see the huge role played by Thomas Cromwell in developing Tudor government and finance. Many historians believe that Thomas Cromwell revolutionised government. Helped by securing the break with Rome, he used Parliament, who allowed him to make these changes. This annoyed conservatives such as Norfolk, who hated the religious reforms that Thomas Cromwell tried to bring in as a result of his break with Rome. However, it must be said that Thomas Cromwell did not have the same freedoms nor the level of power that Wolsey had enjoyed up until his fall from power. So what were some of the contributions made by Thomas Cromwell? They included reforms to the royal household and the Privy Council, the strengthening of the Council of the North, limiting the role of the King's Chamber in handling financial matters, and, importantly, expanding the role of Parliament. The Royal Council was an important advisory body to the King, and it took a key role in the day-to-day running of the country. However, Thomas Cromwell realised that it needed change because there was many problems that needed to be fixed. Before Cromwell's reforms, the Royal Council was responsible for the day-to-day running of the country. However, it had usually been dominated by one individual, such as Thomas Wolsey. Meetings had no rules and they lacked organisation. Discussions and decisions were not officially recorded, and although there were officially 100 members, only a few turned up, and this was mostly made up of clergy, nobles and the King's personal advisers. As a result of Thomas Cromwell, there were some reforms that were made to the Royal Council. Firstly, he created the simpler version called the Privy Council. This consisted of 20 permanent advisers, mostly lawyers and professional administrators, rather than the clergy or nobility. This meant that as a result, personality wouldn't dominate anymore, and the council would be run by the experience of experts. A clerk of the Privy Council was also appointed to record decisions made. There were suggestions by Wolsey in the ordinances, however these suggestions didn't come into fruition until Cromwell's changes the following decade. One area of problem for Henry was that of finance, so one of the things that Thomas Cromwell did was to reform the role of the King's Chamber. Cromwell turned his considerable ability to Henry's financial system. Each year, Henry's income and his expenditure consisted of huge amounts, and often the king spent more than he made. Officials in the King's Chamber were in charge of finances, and the King's Chamber was located in the royal household so that Henry could keep an eye on it. However, by the mid-1530s, Cromwell realised that this system needed reform, so there were 4 new financial institutions which were introduced. Routine tasks, such as keeping a close eye on expenditure and income, bored Henry, and so he rarely got involved, and this allowed a huge amount of misappropriation of funds by people around him. At this point, there were no formal rules outlining how the King's chambers should run. Accounts were not properly kept or checked as a result. Also, the dissolution of the monasteries led to a dramatic increase in the Crown's income, and the King's Chamber would not be able to cope, so some new areas of government and finance needed to be introduced. Due to these problems, Cromwell decided to remove most of the King's Chamber's financial responsibilities, and he introduced new financial courts. There were 4 of them to deal with the financial outcome, predominantly from the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries. These 4 were the Court of Augmentations, which was created in 1536, the Court of First Fruits and Tenths, from 1540, the Court of General Surveyors and the Court of Wards. So the Court of Augmentation was set up to control the land and finances which had previously been under the control of the Catholic Church, but were now run by Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. He also introduced the Court of General Surveyors. This handled the ex-monastic lands before it was amalgamated into the Court of Augmentations, because it now no longer belonged to the Church, and much of this land was either kept by Henry or sold off to nobles and gentry. There was also the Court of First Fruits and Tenths. This was responsible for collecting the money which was previously sent to Rome as annates, which were taxes, and the taxes that had formerly gone to the Pope as a result of Henry taking control of the Church of England now went to himself. And lastly, there was the Court of Wards. This collected the money from the estate of a minor who had inherited their land. It applied to anyone under the age of 21 and was like an inheritance tax that we pay now. As courts, they had the legal powers to settle financial disputes over how much was owned. They helped to make England more bureaucratic. The government was now split into different departments, each with staff and officials who had rules and procedures to follow. Each department received money from a specific source, only paying out money for pre-approved reasons, which made it much more difficult to fiddle. Each department was routinely and carefully checked to ensure that they were acting appropriately. Each department was also staffed by well-trained officials. And now Henry wasn't as involved in monitoring income and expenditure as it was done by people who were much more professional and knowledgeable. Another area that he greatly improved the power of was the power of Parliament. Now, a statute law is an act of Parliament that has been agreed by both houses and signed by the monarch. Today we have Parliament, which consists of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and it has the power to make statute law covering all areas of life. However, this wasn't always the case. Until 1529, Parliament was quite a minor institution, mainly used for approving taxes for things such as wars. England, by this point, was basically a personal monarchy with little use for Parliament. Henry mainly made decisions with his chief minister and other trusted advisers during Wolsey's time. In fact, up to 1531, only 203 acts were passed, and these were mainly for raising taxes. New laws, up until this point, were mainly made through royal proclamation. However, Cromwell increased the importance of Parliament. He did this because he wanted to achieve the break with Rome. This would then strengthen the royal authority of the king and allow Henry to gain his annulment. As a result, between 1532 to 1540, 333 acts were passed, and Parliament now met a lot more frequently. It was now statute law, with the king and Parliament representing the ultimate authority in England and Wales. Cromwell did this because he knew that Parliament could secure support from the people who mattered. If involved in decisions, he knew that people would be more likely to approve them. Wolsey had had a very bad relationship with Parliament, and Cromwell learned from this. So he was not prepared to leave parliamentary approval to chance. He used various strategies to make sure that he got what he wanted. For example, he made sure that MPs were well managed, and he controlled parliamentary business himself. He made sure that his proposals were discussed, and he sat in the House of Commons and guided debates personally as a Member of Parliament. He also personally drafted many of the laws as a trained lawyer. And when he thought things might be very difficult, he ensured that the king attended Parliament when really important decisions were being discussed. The impact of Cromwell's changes was quite significant. It meant that Parliament now were always to be consulted on major matter of reform. Parliament could also pass laws now on virtually every aspect of life. The highest laws of the kingdom were not those made by the king alone, but now by the king with the approval of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. This is best summed up by the phrase, King in Parliament. It was not his intention, but Cromwell had nudged England towards a more modern system of parliamentary government. This is C.L. Barber, 1977. Thank you for listening.